Of all the songs that have been sung within the states and nation, there's none that come so near the heart as Uncle Sam's relation. Yankee Doodle is his name, U.S.'s honored station. Red and white and starry blue, his garb on each occasion. Uncle Sam set up his house, he welcomed every brother, but in the haste of his new life he quite forgot his mother. Now his house is up in arms, a keeper he must find him to sweep and dust.
I love the story of Winslow's Petticoat government. This all-female city government is pretty incredible. It was the second of its kind in the United States and the first of its kind in Arkansas. There would be one later in southern Arkansas, but the precedent was set here in the Ozarks. The women of northwest Arkansas were pretty cool in my opinion. When you dig into the land records, we have single women who stayed single their entire lives, dedicating themselves to education and to their communities. Some of them had lost lovers in war, and some of them just to natural death, but a good many were independent spinsters. Other women were widows who were wealthy enough in their own right to not marry again. They owned land outright, and there were many women in Washington County who signed a deed, and it would read, "In her own right and not her husband's property." So far as I've found to date, most of these well-to-do ladies used their wealth, their business savvy, and their independence for the greater good. There were a few bad apples who may have dreamed of their own little empires, but for the women who did not have the vote yet, this is still pretty incredible. And I always felt that this particular all-female government was one of those hopeful moments in the history of women in the U.S., a great underdog story. So let's take a step back, shall we? In March of 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband that she hoped a draft of a Declaration of Independence had been completed. Specifically, she wrote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in your new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you could remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment our own rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor these customs, which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed in providence under your protection, and in initiation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness." Obviously, John Adams and his lot did not include that in the Declaration of Independence and did not remember the ladies, and only wrote, "All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." The rights obviously were not extended to women, or even black, brown, or Asian members of their community. Indeed, Germans, Irish, Italians, and other European ethnicities were often not seen as white enough or even human enough to be endowed with these rights. That is not to say that women did not exert some control over the circumstances of their lives. We know from writings that Abigail Adams was not the only member of her generation who would often bend her husband's ear. Women were never silent creatures and often influenced the world of the men around them, a husband or even a son. Black women in slave societies and Reconstruction communities could shame a man, and they could come together as a collective to do it if they felt that he had done something not to the benefit of their whole community. White women who were educated or could read and write often talked amongst themselves and had gentle ways of persuading their husbands. But more importantly, women are the bearers of culture and faith even in patriarchal societies. It's through them and their guidance of children that cultural norms, belief systems, and even etiquette are passed down. That has very seldom been the role of women, with the exception of societies that recognize a non-binary individual. So women may have been at a disadvantage, but the females of the culture have never been without some sort of power. And we'll see that especially with the suffrage movement, when women came together to exercise the collective bargaining rights of her sex. Well, that's when stuff can happen. But it wasn't just the suffrage movement. In America, it is the Revolution, the reform movements, the abolitionist movements, Prohibition, Reconstruction, and even Jim Crow era policies. In Arkansas, the Daughters of the Confederacy and other groups that glorified the Civil War and the rebellion of the South to maintain slavery dictated how the history books were written until a few short years ago. In some cases, this collective bargaining can be a problem or problematic, especially when it comes to the unifying of the movement. It's often the middle and upper class women who have the disposable income and the time and energy to negotiate and agitate for a shift in the balance and power within her community. Specifically, the progressive and prohibition movements were not always led by all women, but women who had time to engage in national organizations. Those poorer classes are often simply working to survive day to day, and because women of different classes and different ethnic backgrounds have different needs to make their world more equitable, there has never been a consensus. That's why the suffrage movement took so long and even kind of died out once they got the vote. A workers' movement would rise up in the 1930s and 40s, but again was not as beneficial to the middle class, and working women of color often felt like their needs were falling on deaf ears amongst the white working class. So until the 1960s and 1970s and the sexual revolution, the whole thing stalls for a time. Even the ERA failed to pass multiple times, and so we continue to have a disparity in the wages of women. So overall, women's history just seems like a constant uphill struggle. So the Petticoat government is just such an awesome win in my book. So I generally preface this program with, I am an Oklahoma voter. So for me, I had to understand the Arkansas voting laws. So I went and I looked these up. In 1836, the first constitution of the state of Arkansas was written, and it gave voting rights to any male who was white, a U.S. citizen, and who had lived in Arkansas for 6 months. In 1868, following the Civil War, former Confederate soldiers could not vote because their complicity in the war was seen as an act of treason. And black men in the state of Arkansas could vote under Reconstruction laws. This didn't last long, only until the Brooks-Baxter affair, and then in that same year, in 1874, new restrictions were placed on voters, and including you had to live in the county for at least 10 days. And then later, the restrictions got even tighter. You had to have lived in the state for 12 months, the county for 6 months, and 1 month in the precinct you wanted to vote in. For a time, paupers, which included anyone receiving help from local, county, or state governments, or anyone who had been sent to a poor farm, could not vote either, but this restriction was removed with the 1874 draft. In 1873, anyone convicted of a crime could not vote, and it didn't matter what the crime was. But then in 1874, that was changed to anyone who had been arrested for or convicted of a felony. The changes in the law were focused on limiting black voters. As Reconstruction government were turned back over to the states after 1874 up to about 1877, we begin to see the greater efforts to disenfranchise black voters in the state, but also poor whites. In 1891, you'll see illiteracy meant you could not vote. In 1893, you had to pay a poll tax, and this was $1 per male who wanted to vote in the election. Given that the annual household income was just a little more than $500 a year, this was costly. So few sharecroppers and tenant farmers could vote. You also had to hang on to that receipt for weeks and months at a time, and then bring it with you to show when you voted. I don't know about you, but that would be really difficult for me. Arkansas had an all-white Democratic primary until 1948, and then Arkansas did not let women vote in general elections until 1920, even though many states and territories that joined the Union in the late 19th century gave women voting rights from their very beginning. There was a small women's suffrage movement in Arkansas, but it wasn't until 1900 that things really start to get organized. The problem with letting women vote was that they were more likely to vote for prohibition. So those with interest in producing alcohol banded together to keep women out of the election booth. In 1917, some women could vote in the primaries if they could meet the same requirements as the men, and they were white, they could pass a literacy test, they had paid their poll tax, they had lived in the state and county and precinct for a set amount of time, and they were U.S. citizens. Literacy test was banned in 1965, but even as one form of discrimination was removed, another set of legislation was enacted to further limit who could vote in the state of Arkansas. Redistricting often placed marginalized communities at a disadvantage. It was a way of stacking the deck. If you had a large portion of the population who would say maybe vote for a black candidate or a female candidate or maybe even a populist candidate, you broke the district up and redrew the line so they were no longer voting together, but across multiple precincts. Therefore, they did not have a majority in any precinct. In 2012, in Jeffers versus Beebe, U.S. Supreme Court ruled this tactic was dirty and unconstitutional. Arkansas, Tennessee, and Florida were told to stop it. But this practice, called gerrymandering, continues to this day, and not just in those states. Oklahoma recently did something very similar. Today, to vote in Arkansas, you have to be a U.S. citizen, an Arkansas resident, 18 years or older, have committed no felonies, and be considered mentally competent. I also kind of wonder who gets to decide who's mentally competent. Arkansas does not have a civil rights commission that ensures elections and districting are not discriminatory. It's one of the few states that doesn't. In 2013, the state also required a photo ID to vote, but this was struck down because it was not included in the state constitution. So, in 2015, Arkansas altered its constitution so that they could require a photo ID. In 2021, there were further restrictions on voting rights for the state of Arkansas, which penalized the poor, women, and people of color disproportionately. Think about how many of those categories a single mother could fall into: poor, female, and a person of color. The League of Women Voters filed suit against the state of Arkansas because these restrictions effectively disenfranchised a significant portion of the population. The high courts ruled in favor of the women, but in April of 2022, that ruling was stayed temporarily. Currently, Arkansas has the lowest turnout of eligible voters in the entire United States because of restrictions and gerrymandering. Given what these women faced, I think it's a miracle for that the women of Winslow got elected the way they did. And they did it. So how did the women get the vote? We saw Abigail Adams' comment to her husband. It wasn't like it was a novel idea. 1791 in France, someone had been writing about the same time. She wrote the Declaration of Rights of Women in response to a 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Men. In 1848, in the U.S., we have the Seneca Falls Convention, which presented the Declaration of Sentiment. This document advocated for equality of the sexes. In the late 19th century, as I already stated, Western states and territories gave women the same rights as men to vote, hold property, and so on. But it wasn't until World War I where things really start to get done. Women, like many marginalized groups in the United States, contributed to the war effort. And just like those groups, they started to challenge their second-class status. They could contribute in their own way to make the war a success, and they did so out of patriotic pride. Shouldn't they also be considered citizens with the same rights under the law as white men? If I sacrificed as a citizen but was not seen as a citizen, I might stand up and say, hey, too. Wouldn't you? So out of this, the National Women's Party emerges, and so does the National American Women's Suffrage Association, among others. Then in 1918, the unthinkable happens, at least for the men. Something very shocking indeed. President Woodrow Wilson announces his plan to actually support the suffrage movement. An amendment to the Constitution was proposed in the same year. The text read, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. By the 4th of June, 1919, it had passed in both houses, but it also had to be ratified in order to be an amendment to the Constitution. It needed 36 of the 48 states, because at this point, remember, we don't have Alaska and Hawaii, to ratify it to make it legally binding. So Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan ratified it on the 10th of June, so just a few days later. Later in the month, Kansas, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Texas passed it. In July, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, and Montana ratified it. In the following months of the year, Nebraska, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Utah, California, Maine, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Colorado ratified the amendment. So the year ends. In the early months, 1920, Rhode Island, Colorado, Kentucky, Oregon, Indiana, Wyoming, Nevada, New Jersey, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Washington ratified it. But that's only 35. And this is where the tension starts to build up. It's like it's not going to pass. Washington was the last state to ratify it, and it did it in March of 1920. And we're waiting, and the newspapers are going back and forth, and it's just all the time. Is it going to pass? Is it not going to pass? Is anybody going to do this? Newspapers and politicians and the public begin to speculate that the battle was finished. Or was somebody going to be the 36th state? And then, about the time spring turned into summer, we still don't have any states that have ratified it, but Arkansas papers begin to publish a rumor that Tennessee just might do it. They might be the state that does it. But they're going to take their time about it. They wait until the 18th of August, 1920, and they finally added their name to the list. The 19th Amendment was ratified. A month later, now that it's actually passed, Connecticut goes ahead and joins the list. Then in 1921, Vermont does too. 1923, Delaware. Then we have this huge gap until World War II. Maryland ratified it on 29th of March, 1941, but they did not certify their own ratification until the 25th of February, 1958. So 17 years later. Virginia and Alabama conceded in the early 1950s. Florida and South Carolina would wait until 1969. Georgia and Louisiana in 1970, North Carolina in 71, but Mississippi could wait the longest. They did not ratify it until the 22nd of March, 1984. That means I was born by the time Mississippi finally ratified the 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment faced two major challenges in the Supreme Court. One was dismissed because the state had already allowed women to vote before the amendment was drafted. The second was Lesser versus Garnett. And by passing this amendment, the federal government, the state of Maryland argued, challenged the autonomy of individual states to govern themselves. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the women and not the men from Maryland. Locally here in Northwest Arkansas, the women had been organizing for a while, preparing for this moment to vote. They had also been following the suffragettes for some time. On the 2nd of May, 1914, there were 3 articles on the front page about the movement in the newspaper. In Chicago, one story reported women held a parade down Michigan Avenue, all of them wearing bonnets. On the same day, women hiked into St. Paul, Minnesota, wearing yellow hats. Some of these women had started walking the day before in order to join their sister suffragettes. And the paper announced that the following day, the churches in Washington, D.C. would host suffrage sermons throughout the city as a follow-up to the nationwide marches, hikes, and rallies held on the 2nd. So this article, the following article from the Fayetteville Daily Democrat, talks about local events. And it comes from the 14th of March, 1916. The title of the article was Suffrage League to Meet Thursday. You are invited. Do you oppose votes for women? Then attend the PLE and see the SUFs. They are really quite human and not at all militant looking. Do you believe in votes for women? Then you belong to the League. Go and see what's a-doing. A good program will be given Thursday beginning at 2:30 o'clock at the home of Mrs. George Sutton. You are invited. In November of 1919, word arrived of states that had already been allowing women to vote. And here's a quote from that article. According to all leaders who made the rounds of the election districts, mostly in New York, women in politics have passed the hysterical stage and found their feet. Once the law was passed, women began to organize courses for how to vote and know what they needed to qualify. They held classes at the colleges and schools, and women trained other women how to vote. The first day women could vote en masse, some 26 million new voters entered the polls. And the newspapers covered this. In 1921, some women proposed an early version of the Equal Rights Amendment, which still hasn't passed, because they didn't think suffrage was enough. And this was 6th of October 1921 from the Fayetteville Daily Dem. Full women's rights. No political, civil, or legal disabilities or inequalities on account of sex or on account of marriage, unless applying equally to both sexes, shall exist in the United States or any territory subject to the jurisdiction thereof. At the time, they were hoping this would be the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. Currently, there are hearings being heard to add it, and it would be the 28th Amendment if it would pass today, but it doesn't look like it would pass today. So the Winslow Petticoat government comes into being in 1925, and Harrison publishes an article about it, and it says, Arkansas town has unique distinction. Winslow, Arkansas, which is close to the Oklahoma line above Fort Smith on the Frisco Railroad, is said to be the second city in the United States to have a mayor and council composed of women. So, please make note, however, of what the Harrison boys would like you to remember about how it actually happened. Are you listening? Are you ready? But it should be remembered that the plan was sponsored by the men voters who were in the majority. Mrs. Maud Duncan is mayor, Mrs. Audie Crider, recorder, while 5 councilwomen complete the city administrative personnel, which is said will no doubt select a woman for treasurer. Winslow is fast becoming one of the best resort towns in northwest Arkansas. This is on account of the progressiveness of its citizens. The following year, the Fayetteville Democrat printed the news that the women had participated in a parade. The closest we can get to a full story from the time is Lida Wynn Pace's recounting in the Winslow history she wrote with her brother Robert. That's actually found on pages 34 to 36 if you want to go and check it out. Winslow's petticoat government, which began as a joke in 1925 as the story goes, the ladies who ran for office and won took their jobs very seriously. The winners of the first election of the all-female city government were Audie Crider, wife of the former postmaster who became city clerk and recorder, Mrs. B. Trevany, a businesswoman, Mrs. Daisy Miller, operator of the summer hotel called Hillcrest, Mrs. Etta Black, widow and hardware store owner, Mrs. Lida Cole, businesswoman, Mrs. Florence Morley, lifelong resident. I love that that was her only qualification for the job, was that she was a lifelong resident. Miss Martha Wynn, assistant cashier at the bank, and she became the city treasurer. Miss Stella Wynn, postmistress. Maud Duncan Dunlap, the first woman in Arkansas licensed as a pharmacist and a publisher of the local paper, became the city mayor. This group of women became known as the Petticoat government, who were also selected and who also won in their second term, except for poor Martha Wynn, who got married, but she was replaced by her sister Lida Wynn. So who were these ladies? This is what I could find after scouring census, genealogy, and local records, and it's really not much. So let's start with the mayor, Virginia Maud Dunlap Pierce Duncan. Virginia Maud Dunlap Duncan was the second woman in Arkansas to secure registration as a pharmacist. As a young businesswoman and an editor of a newspaper, she ran for mayor of Winslow with an all-woman slate for city council. This Petticoat government was elected to 2 consecutive terms and gained national attention during its time in office. She was born in 1873 in Fayetteville, and her parents died, and she was later raised by her uncle, Albert Dunlap, and his wife, Virginia. They also raised her brother. So they educated her at home until she was enrolled in high school at Fort Smith. At the age of 16, she received a teacher certificate from Cane Hill College. She taught briefly at a one-room school in the area and played organ at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, which was founded by her foster parents. In 1894, she married Hallam Pierce of Tennessee, a worker for the Frisco Railroad in Winslow. The couple had 2 daughters. One died in infancy, and the other died shortly after the marriage was annulled in 1901. Pierce secured her registration as a pharmacist in 1906, and then she worked in the drugstore in Winslow with her foster father. And then in 1908, she married newspaperman Gilbert Nelson Duncan. The couple had no children. He died of the Spanish flu in 1918, and she continued to run the newspaper. She died in 1958 of pneumonia. Lida Cole is a little more difficult to track down in her own right, but her husband owned and ran a general store and at one point was a lumber salesman. Florence Morley's death certificate lists her occupation as housewife and telephone operator. She lived in Winslow most, if not all, of her life. Her husband was a butcher early on, but later went on to work for the timber companies and railroad as a timber salesman and an agent. Audie Kreider was a housewife, but later in life served as a nurse's aide in the city hospital. Her husband was a postmaster for a time. Bea Trevany died suddenly in her sleep at the age of 61, less than a decade after her term in office, and that's really all I could find about her. Daisy Miller served as the school librarian in the 1950s. Etta Black managed a hardware store. In 1920, Martha Wynne was a cashier at the bank in Winslow. Virginia Spring Dunlap was the wife of Dr. Albert Dunlap and the foster mother of Maud Duncan. I can tell you some things about her, but she and her husband donated the building that became the Helen Dunlap School for Mountain Girls in 1905. Stella Wynne was appointed postmaster in 1923 and 1927. And since Lida wasn't part of the original group, she's not photographed with them in that first photo. But Eliza Hexter Lida Wynne Pace was a telephone operator, an assistant cashier at the bank, and briefly the wife of a minister. I can tell you a lot more later about how controversial this relationship was. And we do have Lida and Robert's papers at the museum, so we know a little bit more about the Wynne family. What I find interesting is that no one has an obituary except for Maud about their part in this extraordinary moment in Winslow's history or even women's history. Perhaps they thought it would become more common. Instead, most of them chose to be defined by their role as a woman or as a mother and a wife and quietly faded back into the traditional role of women with their charitable and civic organizations. Maybe that's because the obituaries were written and the headstones chosen by those left behind. And to those people, that's who these women were first. Mothers, wives, sisters. They weren't necessarily women of government. Or maybe, to these women, being a wife and a mother outshone that brief moment in the petticoat government of Winslow. Having delved into the Wynn family papers, I can tell you that these women lived rich lives with friends and had active social lives. Lida and Martha and Stella and their friends organized trips and plays and amusements and watched each other's flirtations with fascination, derision, envy, and joy. They walked the tracks near the tunnels, hiked the hills and the forests, and made forays into Fayetteville. Some of them were educated and not just to find a husband. Lida's love affairs were especially complicated and heartbreaking to watch play out. But at the same time, I do not think that for any of these ladies, this moment in history was just some sort of lark or a joke. I don't know what really made them decide to run together like this, or for the women of Winslow and some of the men to support them like this. But it couldn't have just been on a whim. And they did an excellent job running for and winning a second term. For me, there are still so many questions that even Lida's letters and diaries do not answer. Who was the ringleader behind this? What was the end goal? Did they achieve everything they wanted to? How did they decide who was going to run for which office? Who supported them? What challenges did they face? And would they do it again if they had it to do all over again? So we've already kind of considered like the moments leading up to the Petticoat government and just how incredible that moment is. But I also kind of want to contextualize them in the modern era. So I want to look at some contemporary statistics and take a moment to acknowledge how extraordinary these ladies are even by today's standards. Women are still underrepresented in political positions in comparison with their numbers in the overall population. Here are the positions held in Northwest Arkansas. I can and will add in the next slide that Siloam Springs recently elected their first female mayor, Judy Nation. In 2020, in the census, Benton County women made up 49.9% of the county population. In Washington County, 49.8%. In Madison County, 49.7%. In Newton County, 49.1%. In Boone County, 50.5%. In Carroll County, 49.9%. So here you can see, this is not all of the mayors in our 6-county mission area. These were just the ones that were easier to find. And you can see in this that Hinesville, St. Paul, and Siloam Springs of the list that I pulled are the only ones that have female mayors. And we didn't deliberately leave anybody out. These were just the easier ones to track down. At the state level, here's what it looks like. So we have 0 for 6 seats of Congress, 31 of 135 seats for state legislature, 2 of 7 seats in the executive branch. So currently the governor is Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and the lieutenant governor is Leslie Rutledge. And remember how I said that Arkansas votes low compared to the rest of you guys? Actually in the 6 counties vote really well. Most of you guys do turn out. At a national level, Arkansas has one of the lowest turnouts for a voter election, in the lower 10 for the last 10 years. In 2020, only Oklahoma had less registered voters turn out. But again, look here at these numbers. You all turned out more numbers than the state average. So I also pulled some stats on like men and women to compare. And at a national level, according to the Center for American Women in Politics, women turn out to vote more than women do supposedly. It's not always reflected in the election results and probably not in the policies. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But Arkansas does seem to follow a national trend with more women voting than men. And here you can see on that third row down that in Arkansas, 62.8% of women who are eligible to vote are registered, and 58.4% of men who are eligible are registered. And then you can see below that who actually votes. It's still low in the nation, but you can see that there are more women than men. So this one here just shows how people, like, again, more women than men. When you're married, you do tend to turn up just about as much as what your husbands do, but widowed, divorced, separated, actually never married is about the same. But you can see kind of the differences between men and women here. And I think the spouse present means he's actually there at the election polling place the same day. And it holds true across races. So this one's the only one that was a little weird. So I was kind of curious, why might older women, even though they tend to outlive men, be less likely to vote? Because here you can see as they get older, women are less likely to vote than men. Kind of that 65 to 74 is where it's about equal, and then after that it drops off. So here, this one is kind of deceptive, and we're going to compare the next chart to see. So this is the proportion of eligible adult population who reported voting by education. So this looks like more people with advanced degrees vote than people with lower levels of education. But whenever you actually look at it by the number of eligible adult population who reported voting by education, then you can see that the advanced degrees actually have fewer numbers to start with. So more people with advanced degrees who can vote do, but there's fewer of them to start with. So really the people who are voting the most are high school graduates, bachelor's degrees, or some college. So, given the history before and after this brief moment in time, these ladies are just pretty phenomenal, in my opinion.
He writes the tangles all about him. Uncle Sam is long in years and he is growing wiser. He now can see 'twas a mistake to have no misadviser. His nephews now have got the reins and looking o'er their shoulder shout to lonely Uncle Sam, goodbye old man forever. Now we're here, dear Uncle Sam, to help you in your trouble. And the first thing best to do is making you a double. Yankee Doodle will be glad to join with us in spreading the news abroad o'er all the land of Uncle Sam's great wedding.